The gavel falls with a thunderous crack that echoes through the packed courtroom. Silence. Then, the judge's voice cuts through the tension like a knife. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In that moment, 73-year-old Martha Williams feels her world collapse. Her weathered hands shake as the cold steel of handcuffs bites into her wrists. The woman who had spent her entire life caring for others, cleaning their homes, raising their children, healing their wounds, now faces dying behind bars for a crime that would destroy everything she had ever stood for. But this isn't just another story of injustice. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the power of unconditional love. Because what happened next in that courtroom would send shockwaves through an entire community and remind us all that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come in the most unexpected packages. You see, Martha Williams wasn't just any defendant. She was a woman whose life had been defined by one simple principle. Love has no color, no boundaries, and no conditions. And 37 years earlier, that principle would lead her to make a decision that would change not just her life, but the lives of 3 homeless children whose society had forgotten. Those children were white. She was black. It was 1986, in the heart of Alabama, where the wounds of segregation still ran deep and suspicion lived on every street corner. But Martha Williams saw something that others couldn't or wouldn't see. She saw 3 souls in desperate need of love. What she couldn't have known was that decades later, when she needed salvation the most, those same children, now successful adults, would move heaven and earth to save the woman who had saved them first. Picture this. It's a sweltering August morning in Montgomery, Alabama. The year is 1986. Martha Williams, then 36 years old, is walking to work before dawn breaks, just as she is every day for the past 15 years. Her uniform is pressed, her shoes are worn but polished, and in her weathered purse, she carries exactly $17.43, her entire fortune. She works as a housekeeper for the Peterson family, one of the wealthiest families in Montgomery's Garden District. 6 days a week, she scrubs their floors, tends their garden, and prepares their meals. The pay is barely enough to keep her own small apartment, but Martha never complains. She believes in the dignity of honest work, in the value of service, in the idea that every job, no matter how humble, matters. But on this particular morning, as Martha rounds a corner onto Oak Street, she sees something that stops her dead in her tracks. 3 children, huddled together on the steps of an abandoned building. The oldest can't be more than 10 years old. The youngest maybe 5. Their clothes are dirty and torn. Their faces are streaked with tears and grime. And they're alone. Completely alone. Martha's first instinct is to keep walking. This is 1986 Alabama, and a black woman approaching 3 white children without permission is asking for trouble. The kind of trouble that can destroy lives and careers and worse. She knows this. Every fiber of her being knows this. But then the youngest child, a little girl with matted blonde hair, looks up at her with eyes so full of pain and hope that Martha feels her heart break open. And in that moment, Martha Williams makes a choice that will define the rest of her life. Before we continue with Martha's incredible journey, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is touching your heart like it's touching mine, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Stories like Martha's deserve to be shared, and your subscription helps us bring more of these powerful human experiences to light. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to storytellers like us who believe that every person's story matters. And speaking of stories that matter, if you want to dive deeper into incredible human stories like this one, join our weekly newsletter. We share the most inspiring, heart-wrenching, and uplifting stories from around the world, delivered straight to your inbox. The link is in the description below. To understand why Martha Williams would risk everything for 3 strangers, you need to understand where she came from. And Martha's story begins in the cotton fields of rural Alabama, where poverty wasn't just a condition. It was a way of life that passed from generation to generation like an heirloom no one wanted to inherit. Martha was born in 1950 to Sarah and James Williams, sharecroppers who worked land they would never own for wages they could never live on. By the time Martha was 5 years old, her small hands were already picking cotton alongside her parents, her fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, her back aching from bending over rows that seemed to stretch forever. Education was a luxury the Williams family couldn't afford. While other children her age were learning to read and write, Martha was learning the harsh mathematics of survival. How many pounds of cotton it took to buy a loaf of bread, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, how to make a single chicken feed a family of 5 for 3 days. But Martha's mother, Sarah, possessed something that no amount of poverty could take away: an unshakable faith and an enormous heart. Every Sunday, Sarah would walk Martha and her siblings 3 miles to the small Baptist church in their community. And every Sunday, she would whisper the same words in Martha's ear. Baby, we may not have much, but we got love. And love is the only thing in this world that multiplies when you give it away. Those words would echo in Martha's mind for the rest of her life. When Martha turned 16, tragedy struck with brutal efficiency. James Williams suffered a massive heart attack while working in the fields. There was no money for doctors, no insurance, no safety net. Martha watched her father, the strongest man she ever known, wither away in their tiny shack over the course of 3 agonizing weeks. The day after her father's funeral, Martha made a decision that would change everything. She packed her few belongings into a cardboard suitcase, kissed her mother goodbye, and took a Greyhound bus to Montgomery. She was going to find work. She told herself, real work, the kind that paid enough to send money home and maybe, just maybe, build a different kind of life. But Montgomery in 1966 was not kind to a young black woman with no education and no connections. Martha slept in bus stations, ate day-old bread from bakery dumpsters, and knocked on door after door, begging for any kind of work. Most doors slammed shut the moment she opened her mouth. Others opened just long enough for someone to shout ugly words that I won't repeat here. For 2 months, Martha survived on hope and stubbornness. She was down to her last $3 when Mrs. Elizabeth Peterson answered her door. Mrs. Peterson was a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who had built her family's wealth through shrewd investments and an iron will. She looked Martha up and down for a long moment, taking in her worn clothes and desperate expression. You ever cleaned house before? Mrs. Peterson asked. Yes, ma'am, Martha replied, though she had never cleaned anything fancier than her family's 2-room shack. You reliable? Yes, ma'am. You honest? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Peterson studied her for another long moment. Then, almost grudgingly, she stepped aside. We'll try you for a week. $6 a day. You mess up once, you're gone. You steal so much as a paperclip, I'll have you arrested. Understood. Martha nodded so vigorously, she almost lost her balance. $6 a day was more money than she had ever imagined earning. What Mrs. Peterson couldn't have known was that she was hiring someone who would redefine what it meant to be dedicated. Martha didn't just clean the Peterson house. She transformed it. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed like mirrors. She polished silver until it sparkled like diamonds. She tended the garden with the same care she had once given to her mother's vegetable patch, coaxing roses to bloom and hedges to grow with mathematical precision. But more than that, Martha brought something to the Peterson household that money couldn't buy: genuine care. When Mrs. Peterson's elderly mother came to visit and fell ill, Martha stayed overnight to tend to her, refusing any extra pay. When the Petersons' teenage son broke his arm and couldn't participate in sports, Martha spent her breaks teaching him card games and telling him stories to keep his spirits up. Slowly, grudgingly, the Peterson family began to see Martha not just as hired help, but as an indispensable part of their lives. Her weekly trial period turned into a month, then 6 months, then years. By 1970, Martha Williams had become as permanent a fixture in the Peterson household as the mahogany dining table or the crystal chandelier. But permanence came with a price. Martha's own dreams, vague as they had been, began to fade. She had hoped to save enough money to go back to school, maybe learn to read and write properly. Instead, every spare dollar went back to her mother in rural Alabama, helping keep the family farm afloat after her father's death. She had dreamed of marriage, of children of her own, but 6 days a week at the Peterson house left little time for romance, and the men in her church seemed intimidated by her independence and steady employment. She had imagined traveling, seeing the world beyond Montgomery's city limits. Instead, her universe shrank to the familiar routes between her small apartment and the Petersons' mansion, with brief detours to church on Sundays and the grocery store on Wednesday evenings. By 1986, Martha Williams had been cleaning the same house for 20 years. Her hands were permanently stained from cleaning solutions. Her back ached constantly from years of scrubbing and lifting. Her dreams had been folded up and stored away like old clothes she would never wear again. But she had also become something she never expected: a woman of quiet dignity and unshakable strength. She had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of working in a white household in the South. She had mastered the delicate balance of being helpful without being subservient, caring without being presumptuous. Most importantly, she had never forgotten her mother's words about love being the only thing that multiplies when you give it away. And on that sweltering August morning in 1986, as she stood on Oak Street staring at three homeless children, all of that strength, all of that dignity, all of that carefully accumulated wisdom would be put to the ultimate test. Because Martha Williams was about to discover that sometimes the most important moment of your life comes disguised as just another ordinary day. What would you have done in Martha's position? Standing there on that street corner, knowing that helping those children could destroy everything you had worked for, but also knowing that walking away might destroy something far more important, your soul? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Martha's feet felt like they were made of lead as she approached the three children huddled on those concrete steps. With each step, a voice in her head screamed warnings. Turn around. Walk away. This isn't your problem. This isn't your place. But a stronger voice, one that sounded remarkably like her mother's, whispered back, love is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away. The oldest child, a boy with sandy brown hair and hollow eyes, looked up as Martha's shadow fell across him. He immediately pulled the two younger children closer to him, his thin arms wrapping around them like a shield. The protective gesture broke Martha's heart. This child, he couldn't be more than 10, was already carrying the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. Hey there, Martha said softly, crouching down so she was at their eye level. What are y'all doing out here so early? The boy's eyes darted nervously between Martha and the street behind her, as if he expected someone dangerous to appear at any moment. We're waiting, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Waiting for what, baby? The boy's jaw clenched with stubbornness that reminded Martha of herself at that age. For our mama to come back. She said she was just going to the store. She said she'd be right back. Martha's heart sank. She had heard this story before, seen it play out in her own neighborhood countless times. The mother who goes to the store and never returns. The children left behind to fend for themselves, clinging to hope long after hope should have died. When did she leave? Martha asked gently. The boy looked at the little girl in his arms. She couldn't be more than 5, with blonde curls that should have been bouncing with joy but instead hung limp with neglect. 3 days ago, he admitted, his voice cracking. But she's coming back. She promised. 3 days. These children have been surviving on the street for 3 days. Martha's mind raced. She was already late for work. Mrs. Peterson didn't tolerate tardiness, and Martha couldn't afford to lose her job. But looking at these 3 small faces, the boy trying so hard to be brave, the middle child clinging silently to his siblings, the little girl whose eyes held more pain than any child should ever know, Martha realized she was facing a choice that would define who she truly was. What are your names? She asked. I'm Tommy, the boy said hesitantly. This is Sarah, he nodded to the little girl. And that's Michael. The middle child, maybe 7 years old, hadn't said a word since Martha arrived. Well, Tommy, Sarah, and Michael, I'm Martha. And I'll tell you what, how about you come with me and we get you something to eat? You must be hungry. Tommy's eyes narrowed with the suspicion of a child who had learned too young that adults couldn't be trusted. Why would you help us? The question hit Martha like a physical blow. Why indeed? These weren't her children. She owed them nothing. Helping them could cost her everything. In 1986 Alabama, a black woman taking in white children, without permission, was asking for trouble she couldn't even imagine. But as Martha looked into Tommy's eyes, she saw something that transcended race, transcended social expectations, transcended fear. She saw her younger self, desperate, alone, fighting to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. Because, Martha said simply, everybody needs somebody to care about them. That first day, Martha called in sick to work for the first time in 20 years. She took the children to her small apartment, a modest one-bedroom space that suddenly felt enormous with the possibility of love. She fed them scrambled eggs and toast, their first real meal in days. She ran warm baths and found them clean clothes from a church donation box she kept in her closet. Most importantly, she listened to their story. Tommy was 10, the man of the family since their father had disappeared 2 years earlier. Sarah was 5, still asking for her mama every few hours. Michael was 7 and hadn't spoken since the day their mother left. Trauma had stolen his voice, leaving him to communicate only through nods and an occasional tear. Their mother, Linda, was 26 and fighting addiction. She loved her children. Tommy insisted fiercely, but the drugs loved her more. She had tried to get clean, tried to build a stable home for them, but every attempt ended the same way, with her disappearing for days or weeks, leaving the children to survive however they could. Martha told herself this would be temporary, just until social services could find the children a proper home. just until their mother returned, just until someone more qualified, someone more appropriate, someone white could take over. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Martha's small apartment transformed. The couch became Tommy's bed. Sarah slept with Martha, and they set up a small cot for Michael in the corner. Martha's savings, what little she had, went toward clothes and school supplies. Her evenings, once spent in blessed solitude after long days of work, now revolved around homework and bedtime stories and 1,000 small crises that come with raising children. The Peterson family, to their credit, were surprisingly understanding. When Martha finally explained her situation, Mrs. Peterson, who had raised 4 children of her own, simply nodded. "Bring them with you," she said. "They can play in the backyard while you work." But Martha, her voice grew serious. "Be careful. There are people in this town who won't understand what you're doing." Mrs. Peterson was right to worry. Neighbors whispered when Martha walked down the street with 3 white children trailing behind her. Store clerks watched them suspiciously, as if Martha might be kidnapping them in broad daylight. Other black families in her apartment complex questioned her judgment, wondering why she was risking everything for children who weren't her own, children whose race had oppressed their people for generations. But Martha had made her choice, and she had never been one to back down from a decision once it was made. These children needed her, and she needed them in ways she was only beginning to understand. Because for the first time in her adult life, Martha Williams had a purpose beyond mere survival. She had someone to protect, someone to nurture, someone to love unconditionally. The dream she had folded away and stored in the dark corners of her heart began to unfold again, not for herself, but for Tommy, Sarah, and Michael. She would make sure they got an education. She would teach them to read and write better than she ever could. She would give them the childhood stability she had never known, the security her own parents had never been able to provide. Most importantly, she would love them with the fierce, protective love that only comes from choosing your family rather than simply being born into it. How do you think Martha's community reacted to her decision to take in these 3 white children? What challenges do you think she faced that she didn't anticipate? Share your thoughts below. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 7 months after Martha had first found the children on Oak Street. She was braiding Sarah's hair for school, a ritual that had become as natural to her as breathing, when the phone rang with a harsh insistence that only bad news seems to carry. "Miss Williams." The voice was crisp, professional, cold. "This is Janet Morrison from Alabama Department of Human Resources. We need to speak with you about the 3 minor children currently in your care." Martha's hand stilled in Sarah's hair. The little girl looked up at her with those bright blue eyes that had learned to read Martha's moods like a weather vane reads the wind. "What about them?" Martha asked, though she already knew. She had been dreading this call for months, knowing it would come eventually. Someone had reported her. Someone had decided that what she was doing wasn't right, wasn't proper, wasn't legal. "We'll need to schedule a home visit. Today, if possible." There have been concerns raised about the children's welfare. Concerns about their welfare. Martha almost laughed at the irony. 7 months ago, these children had been eating out of garbage cans and sleeping on concrete steps. Now Tommy was reading at grade level. Sarah had gained 15 pounds and smiled every day, and Michael, miracle of miracles, had started speaking again. His first word in months had been "Mama," directed at Martha as she tucked him into bed one night. But Martha knew that none of that would matter to the woman on the other end of the phone. The social worker arrived that afternoon with the kind of clipboard and stern expression that seemed designed to find fault rather than solutions. Janet Morrison was a thin woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that cataloged every detail of Martha's small apartment like a detective gathering evidence. "Miss Williams, I'll get straight to the point. These children have been placed in your care without proper legal authorization. You're not a licensed foster parent. You haven't undergone background checks. And frankly, the racial dynamics of the situation raise serious questions about whether this placement is in the children's best interests." Martha felt her temper flare, a dangerous emotion she had spent years learning to control. "Their best interests," she repeated, her voice carefully measured. "Ma'am, with all due respect, when I found these children, they were starving and sleeping on the street. Now they're healthy, they're in school, they're loved. How is that not in their best interests?" Ms. Morrison's expression didn't soften. "Miss Williams, I understand your intentions were good, but there are procedures, protocols. These children need to be placed in an appropriate home with suitable guardians." Appropriate. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Martha knew exactly what it meant. even if Miss Morrison was too professional to say out loud. Appropriate meant white. The children, who had been playing quietly in the corner, sensed the tension in the room. Tommy moved protectively toward his siblings, that same fierce guardianship Martha had first witnessed on Oak Street. Sarah pressed herself against Martha's legs, her small hands clutching at Martha's skirt. "Please don't take us away," Tommy said, his voice breaking with the way of a child who had already lost too much. "Martha's our family now. She takes care of us." Miss Morrison's clipboard made a soft scratching sound as she wrote something down. "I'm sure Miss Williams has done her best, but—" "She saved us," Michael interrupted, speaking with a clarity and force that surprised everyone in the room. For months, his words had come slowly, hesitantly, as if he was afraid they might disappear again. But now they rushed out in a torrent of emotion. "When Mama left, we thought we were going to die. Martha found us, and she saved us, and she loves us, and we love her, and you can't take us away." The social worker looked uncomfortable for the first time since arriving, but her resolve didn't waver. Children often become attached to temporary caregivers. "That doesn't mean—" "Temporary?" Martha's control finally snapped. 20 years of biting her tongue, of swallowing her pride, of saying "yes, ma'am" and "no, ma'am" to people who looked at her like she was invisible exploded in that moment. "These children have lived with me for 7 months. I've nursed them through sickness, helped them with homework, held them when they cried for their mama. I've loved them like they were my own blood. How is that temporary?" "Miss Williams, please lower your voice." Getting emotional won't help anyone. But Martha was beyond caring about helping her case. All she could think about was the night Sarah had woken up screaming from nightmares about being abandoned again, and how Martha had held her until dawn, promising over and over that she would never leave her. She thought about Tommy's pride when he brought home his first A+ on a spelling test, how he had run to show Martha before anyone else. She thought about Michael's slow return to speech, each new word a small victory they had celebrated together. "These children need stability," Ms. Morrison continued. "They need to be placed with family that can provide for them properly, long-term. We have a lovely family in Birmingham, the Hendersons. They're experienced foster parents. They have the resources to—" "They're white," Martha said quietly. Ms. Morrison's cheeks flushed slightly. "Miss Williams, I resent the implication." "It's not an implication. It's a fact. These children are being removed from my care because I'm black and they're white. Everything else is just paperwork." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children seemed to sense they were witnessing something that would change everything. Finally, Ms. Morrison cleared her throat. "The children will be picked up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Please have their belongings ready." That night, Martha didn't sleep. She sat in her small kitchen, drinking coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at the pictures the children had drawn and taped to her refrigerator, stick figures of a woman, and 3 children holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "Our family," written in Sarah's careful 5-year-old handwriting. The children had cried themselves to sleep, exhausted by the terror of another abandonment. Martha had promised them she would fight, that she wouldn't let them be taken away. But what weapons did she have in this battle? No money for lawyers, no political connections, no legal standing. She was just a black maid who had loved 3 white children with all her heart. And in 1987 Alabama, that wasn't nearly enough. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where love wasn't enough to overcome systemic barriers? How do you think the foster care system could better serve children like Tommy, Sarah, and Michael? Let us know in the comments. The years that followed were like a slow-motion heartbreak that played out over decades. Martha would catch glimpses of the children's lives through carefully managed visits, holiday cards with someone else's return address, an occasional phone call when the caseworkers weren't listening. Tommy, Sarah, and Michael were placed with the Henderson family in Birmingham, a wealthy couple with a sprawling suburban home, private school education for all their foster children, and what the state deemed appropriate resources. On paper, it looked perfect. In reality, it was a different kind of poverty, the poverty of the spirit. The Hendersons were good people. Martha told herself during the darkest moments. They weren't cruel or neglectful. They provided food, shelter, clothing, education. All the measurable things that case files could document and courts could quantify. What they couldn't provide was a specific kind of love that comes from choosing someone when the world tells you not to. The love that Martha had given freely, desperately, completely. During supervised visits, the children would cling to Martha with a desperation that broke her heart fresh every time. Tommy, now 11, had become quieter, more withdrawn. The fierce protectiveness he had shown for his siblings had transformed into a sullen resignation that scared Martha more than his old defiance ever had. Sarah, now 6, would whisper secrets in Martha's ear during their brief hugs. How she still had nightmares about their real mother. How she missed sleeping in Martha's bed. How she had hidden one of Martha's old aprons under her new bed because it smelled like home. And Michael, sweet Michael who fought so hard to find his voice again, had retreated back into silence. Not the traumatized muteness of his early years, but a deliberate quietness that felt like a protest against a world that had separated him from the only mother figure who had ever truly seen him. The visits became less frequent as the years passed. The state's theory was that continued contact would prevent the children from bonding appropriately with their new family. Martha fought every reduction, every restriction, but fighting the system required resources she didn't have and allies she couldn't find. By 1995, Martha was allowed to see the children only twice a year, supervised visits in a sterile conference room at the Department of Human Resources building. By 2000, those visits had been reduced to annual phone calls on their birthdays. Martha threw herself into work with the intensity of someone trying to outrun grief. She took on additional cleaning jobs, working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. She saved every penny she could, harboring a vague hope that money might somehow buy her way back into their lives. But money couldn't heal the wound that had opened in her heart the day they took her children away. Nothing could fill the space that Tommy's laughter had occupied, or the quiet comfort of Sarah's small hand in hers, or the triumph of Michael's slowly returning words. The Peterson family, who had watched this tragedy unfold with their own brand of helpless sympathy, did what they could. Mrs. Peterson quietly paid for a lawyer to help Martha navigate the appeals process, though they both knew it was hopeless. The system had decided, and the system rarely changed its mind. Years turned into decades. Martha's hair went gray, then white. Her hands became more arthritic from years of cleaning solutions and scrubbing. Her back curved from decades of bending over other people's messes. But she never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, her children would come back to her. She never knew that they were hoping for the same thing. Tommy graduated from high school in 1996, a quiet ceremony that Martha wasn't allowed to attend. He went to college on a partial scholarship, studying business with the kind of grim determination that spoke of someone trying to build a life on his own terms. He never stopped thinking about the woman who had saved him, who had loved him when the world said she shouldn't, who had been stolen from him by a system that claimed to know what was best. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's blonde hair, but Martha's fierce heart. She became a teacher, drawn to working with at-risk children by experiences she couldn't fully explain to her colleagues. In quiet moments, she would remember the feeling of safety that had wrapped around her like a blanket during those 7 months in Martha's tiny apartment. Michael found his voice again, but he used it to become a lawyer. Specifically, a family law attorney who specialized in cases involving foster care and adoption. His colleagues thought his passion for these cases came from an abstract sense of justice. They had no idea it came from a very specific memory of injustice, the memory of watching the woman who had saved his life being deemed inappropriate to love him. The 3 siblings stayed in touch, bound together not just by shared DNA, but by shared grief. They talked often about Martha, wondering where she was, whether she was okay, whether she ever thought about them the way they thought about her every single day. They searched for her, of course. As adults with resources and connections, they hired private investigators, scoured social media, reached out to old neighbors. But Martha Williams was a common name in Alabama, and the Martha they remembered had lived in a world that didn't leave much of a digital footprint. They found dozens of Martha Williamses. They found none who had once loved 3 homeless children enough to risk everything. What they didn't know was that Martha had been searching for them too, with the limited resources available to her. What they didn't know was that she had never stopped loving them, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. What none of them knew was that their reunion would come not through their desperate searches, but through a tragic misunderstanding that would threaten to destroy Martha's life completely. In 2023, 37 years after that first meeting on Oak Street, 73-year-old Martha Williams found herself in the fight of her life, not fighting for the right to love her children this time, but fighting for her freedom, her dignity, and her very life. The charge was attempted murder. The victim was Mrs. Peterson's son, Richard, the same boy Martha had once comforted when he broke his arm, the same teenager she had taught card games to pass the time during his recovery. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. Martha had been found standing over Richard Peterson's unconscious body, a bloody kitchen knife in her hand. No one else in the house. The evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints were on the weapon. His blood was on her clothes. There were no witnesses to contradict what seemed like an open-end shut case. What the prosecution didn't know was that Martha had actually been trying to save Richard's life, not take it. She had arrived at work that morning to find him collapsed on the kitchen floor, the victim of a heart attack, a kitchen knife fallen from his hand where he had been making breakfast. In her panic to help, she had picked up the knife and moved it aside, contaminating the crime scene in her desperation to perform CPR. But who would believe the word of an elderly black made over the apparent evidence of an attempted murder? Can you imagine the desperation Martha must have felt, facing life in prison for trying to save someone's life? What do you think went through Tommy, Sarah, and Michael's minds when they learned about her situation? Share your thoughts below. The news reached Tommy first, a small item buried on page 6 of the Birmingham Herald. Local woman charged with attempted murder of employer's son. The article was brief, clinical, mentioning only the defendant's name, age, and the charges against her. Martha Williams, 73 years old. Attempted murder. Tommy's hands shook as he held the newspaper. After 37 years of searching, he had found his mother in the worst possible way. Within hours, he had called Sarah and Michael. Within days, they had hired the best criminal defense attorney they could find. Within weeks, they had uncovered the truth that the prosecution had been too eager to ignore. The evidence told a different story when examined by investigators who weren't looking for a quick conviction. Richard Peterson's medical history revealed a pattern of heart problems. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed Martha arriving at her usual time, not fleeing the scene as a guilty person might. Most importantly, the blood spatter patterns were consistent with someone performing CPR, not someone committing assault. But the case had already gained momentum in the media and the courts. A poor, elderly black woman charged with attacking her wealthy white employer. It was a story that seemed to confirm every ugly stereotype and prejudice that still lurked in the corners of Alabama society. The trial was set for November 2023. Martha, unable to make bail, spent 6 months in county jail, her health deteriorating rapidly in conditions no 73-year-old should have to endure. That's when Tommy, Sarah, and Michael made their move. Michael, using his connections in the legal community, managed to get himself appointed to Martha's defense team. Sarah, now a respected educator, organized a media campaign to tell Martha's true story. Tommy, who had built a successful business over the years, quietly funded everything: the legal fees, the private investigators, the expert witnesses who could prove Martha's innocence. But none of them revealed their connection to Martha until the day of the trial. November 15th, 2023. The courtroom was packed, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha sat at the defendant's table, looking frilier than her years, her hands shaking from stress and poor health. She had been assigned a public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the media attention and the complexity of the case. That's when the courtroom doors opened and 3 well-dressed adults walked in. Martha looked up and saw them at the same moment they saw her. The recognition was instantaneous, electric, transformative. Tommy, now 47, with lines around his eyes with the same protective stance he had carried as a 10-year-old boy. Sarah, now 42, her blonde hair now styled and professional, but her eyes still holding that same bright warmth. Michael, now 44, wearing a lawyer's suit but carrying himself with the quiet dignity Martha remembered. The reunion happened in front of a packed courtroom, in front of news cameras, in front of a judge and jury who had no idea they were witnessing one of the most powerful demonstrations of love overcoming injustice that had ever played out in an Alabama courtroom. "Your Honor," Michael said, rising from the gallery, "I request permission to address the court." The judge, confused by this breach of protocol, nevertheless allowed it. "My name is Michael Stevens. These are my siblings, Thomas and Sarah. 37 years ago, this woman, Martha Williams, saved our lives. We were homeless, starving, forgotten by a system that was supposed to protect us. She risked everything to love us, to care for us, to give us hope." The courtroom was dead silent. The state took us away from her because they said she wasn't appropriate to be our mother, because she was black and we were white, because she was poor and we deserved better. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they were especially wrong about her character. Sarah stood up next. "Martha Williams is the most honest, loving, selfless person I have ever known. The idea that she would hurt another human being is not just unlikely. It's impossible. She doesn't have violence in her heart. She never did." Tommy was the last to speak. "Your Honor, we spent 37 years looking for the woman who saved us. We found her here in this courtroom, accused of a crime that goes against everything she stands for. We're here to tell you who Martha Williams really is. She's not a defendant. She's not a criminal. She's our mother, and she's innocent. The impact on the courtroom was immediate and profound. Hardened reporters wiped away tears. Jurors sat transfixed. Even the prosecutor looked shaken. The defense that followed was swift and decisive. Michael's legal expertise, combined with the resources Tommy had provided and the credibility Sarah's reputation afforded, demolished the prosecution's case piece by piece. Expert witnesses proved Martha had been trying to save Richard Peterson's life, not take it. Character witnesses testified to her decades of faithful service, her reputation for honesty, her deep religious faith that prohibited violence of any kind. But the most powerful testimony came from Richard Peterson himself, who had recovered from his heart attack and insisted on testifying from his hospital bed via video link. "Martha Williams saved my life," he said, his voice weak but certain. "When I collapsed, she performed CPR until the paramedics arrived. She didn't attack me. She saved me, just like she's been saving members of my family for over 50 years. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was unanimous, not guilty on all charges. But the real verdict, the one that mattered most, came in the moments after the judge's gavel fell. Martha, free at last, walked directly to her children. The embrace that followed was worth 37 years of waiting, worth every moment of separation, worth every tear and every lonely night, and every prayer whispered into the darkness. "I never stopped loving you," Martha whispered as she held him close. "Not for one single day." "We know, Mama," Tommy replied, using the word he hadn't spoken in decades. "We never stopped loving you either." The story of Martha Williams and her children spread far beyond that Alabama courtroom. It became a testament to the power of love to transcend every barrier society tries to build. It became proof that family is not defined by blood or race or law, but by the choice to love unconditionally and the courage to fight for that love, no matter the cost. Martha Williams spent her remaining years surrounded by the family she had chosen and who had chosen her back. Tommy, Sarah, and Michael made sure she never wanted for anything ever again. They gave her the retirement she had never been able to afford, the security she had never known, and most importantly, the daily presence of the love that had sustained her through nearly 4 decades of separation. When Martha passed away peacefully in 2028 at the age of 78, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. But the 3 people who mattered most carried her casket, just as she had carried them through the darkest moments of their childhood. The inscription on her headstone, chosen by Tommy, Sarah, and Michael, reads simply, "Martha Williams, Mother, love multiplies when you give it away." In a world that often seems divided by fear, hatred, and misunderstanding, Martha's story reminds us that love, real, unconditional, sacrificial love, is still the most powerful force in the universe. It reminds us that family is not about the color of our skin or the size of our bank accounts, but about the size of our hearts and our willingness to open them to those who need us most. And it reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are the ones society deems most ordinary. Sometimes the most profound acts of courage happen not on battlefields or in boardrooms, but in small apartments where a woman chooses to love 3 homeless children, knowing it might cost her everything. Martha Williams was just a maid. She was also a hero. She was just a woman. She was also a mother. She was just one person trying to make a difference in an unjust world. And she changed everything. Martha's story shows us that love truly has no boundaries. Have you ever been touched by someone's unconditional love when you least expected it? How has this story changed your perspective on what it means to be family? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. These stories matter, and they deserve to be told. If Martha's story has moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of love. And remember, in your own life, you have the power to be someone else's Martha Williams. You have the power to choose love, even when the world tells you not to, especially then.